Near the turn of the century, Egypt was suffering from numerous plagues, famines, and a French invasion. In the 1700s, Egyptian merchants made a great deal of wealth based off of the Yemeni coffee trade, with a 75% profit rate. However, cheaper coffee from the Antilles displaced Yemen. The French and even the Ottomans started to import the cheaper coffee from the Antilles. French imports of Egyptian textiles, an industry which made up 45.1% of the Egyptian economy, also fell in the period. By 1783, the Egyptians had a trade deficit of 60 million paras. The Ottomans accounted for 45% of their trade, 35% was in the Red Sea, and 14% with Europe. Egypt also suffered severe inflation and debasement in the 1700s that saw the para's value decline by 50%. In 1783, the Icelandic volcanic fissure Laki erupted and produced horrible results for many areas of the world. The monsoons of the Indian Ocean, which feed the Nile, were weakened and produced the lowest Nile flood between 1737 and 1800. This, and a plague in southern Egypt that greatly reduced the animal population, caused a famine. C. F. Fahmy estimated that 1/6 of the population had died between 1783 and 1785. Another disease decimated livestock in northern Egypt during a time of drought in 1787. A plague struck the eastern Mediterranean in 1791 and killed over 300,000 people in Egypt. 1,000 to 2,000 people were reported to die every day during this plague, and many of the leaders in Egypt, including Ismail Bey, died. Another poor flood occurred in 1792, and a plague broke out again between 1799 and 1800. Wheat prices in Egypt rose from 92 paras in the 1740s to 715 by 1784. In the 1760s and 1770s, Ali Bey al-Kabir and Abu al-Dabab seized large amounts of land to hand out as patronage. Arab landholders in Upper Egypt were particularly targeted hard, but Ali Bey al-Kabir died before reorganizing the area. Upper Egypt was in a semi-anarchic state until the 1800s. This occurred as Ottoman power was waning, and several Egyptian rulers conducted invasions into Syria. The Ottomans were unable to enforce their rule, as their soldiers were tied up fighting wars against Russia. Ali Bey al-Kabir attempted to reform Egypt. He created his own army in 1768, increased raw material exports, and attempted to gain control over the Red Sea trade by taking Hijaz, but was defeated by the Ottomans. Egypt was suffering from a series of internal conflicts between the Mamluks and Ottomans. This was the backdrop of Egypt when Napoleon launched his invasion in 1798. The French attempted to reform the tax system, but local opposition and them only holding the Delta prevented this. For instance, the French abolished tax forms in 1799, but they would continue to function until their seizure by Muhammad Ali in 1812. The French were eventually driven out. Muhammad Ali, an Albanian born in Kavala, became the ruler of Egypt and a central figure of early 19th century Ottoman history. His early life has many mythical elements, some created by himself, and those will be shown in an accompanying YouTube short. Muhammad Ali followed his father in the tobacco trade and participated in a few small battles. 300 men from Kavala were requested for the Ottoman expedition against the French in Egypt, and Muhammad Ali was appointed as second in command to the son of the regional governor. The force arrived in Egypt in 1801, and the governor's son was one of the first deaths, which left Muhammad Ali in charge. His military skill was witnessed, and he was promoted to lead 1,000 men. He eventually became the second in command of all the Albanian soldiers in Egypt. The years after the French invasion would see internal turmoil as the Ottomans, Albanians, and Mamluks struggled for the control over Egypt. The Albanians under Muhammad Ali eventually won out. I will not go into the details of his rise to power, but an interesting detail is that the Ottomans attempted to give him the governorship of Jeddah and made him a Pasha in an attempt to push him out of Egypt. This instead strengthened his status as a contender, and he overthrew the Ottoman governor Hurshid Pasha. Coups and assassinations of the Ottoman sultans prevented them from intervening in Egypt before Muhammad Ali properly established himself. They would instead use Muhammad Ali for military campaigns in Arabia. One of the most important events that cemented his power was the massacre of the Mamluks, the last threat to his power. In 1809, Muhammad Ali ordered that Waqf land, which accounted for 1/5 of arable land in the country, be subject to taxation. Waqfs were given land by the Ottoman sultans and were meant to give their revenue to charitable and religious activities, but by the 18th century, they were being operated by people without legal rights to it and were keeping the money for themselves. In 1812, Muhammad Ali seized all the tax forms. The administrative language of Egypt was changed from Turkish to Arabic. A series of wars at the beginning of his reign benefited Egypt's economy. The British paid high prices for Egyptian grain to feed their soldiers during Napoleonic Wars, while a war between the Ottomans and Russians from 1806 to 1812 blocked the Black Sea trade and made Egypt the sole supplier of grain in the eastern Mediterranean. Bernardino Drovetti, French consul to Egypt, reported that Egypt was earning around 3 million francs just from grain exports alone. At one point, Egypt was making 45 to 50 paras in profit from the grain trade. The French, once Egypt's main European trading partner, was also being displaced by cheaper British cloth in Egypt. The Ottomans imposed an embargo on grain exports, but Muhammad Ali ignored it and excused it by saying that grain exports were paying for Alexandrian fortifications in a planned campaign against the Wahhabists. By the end of these wars, Drovetti estimated that Egypt had an annual income of 20 million francs, but records show that Egypt's budget from 1813 to 1814 was less than 9 million francs. When Muhammad Ali came to power, there were 514 miles of canals in Egypt, but this grew to around 1,200 by the end of his reign. This expanded the cultivable land by 18%. These projects, which moved over 20 million cubic meters of silt, had an average of 400,000 workers per year to create and maintain them. Work on the Mahmudiyya Canal between 1817 and 1820 had over 315,000 workers. The working conditions of these projects were poor, and the Mahmudiyya Canal alone killed up to 100,000 people. This 3-year project cost around 7.5 million francs. Afaf Lutfi al-Sayyid-Marsot estimated that Muhammad Ali's irrigation constructions expanded to the amount of cultivable land by 1,176,588 fadans. Long staple cotton was introduced to Egypt in 1821. Egypt previously grew short staple cotton, which was not enough to meet local demand. Cotton grew to become an important export, but did not become a popular crop for the peasants until Ismail's reign. The British were importing Egyptian cotton 10 times more than cereals by 1840. Egypt's industrial power peaked in 1837, with 29 cotton factories, but this declined to 15 by 1840, following failed wars and diseases. Egyptian cotton was distributed worldwide by 2 companies, Briggs & Co. of the United Kingdom and Messrs. Violier and Graban of. Another interesting piece of Egypt's agriculture in this period was rice. Rice was also under a trade monopoly, and so much of it was exported that there was not enough for domestic demand. Indian rice was instead imported to meet domestic needs. Muhammad Ali's later reign was marked by multiple poor Nile floods and famines that only made the poor financial state caused by failing military campaigns worse. His pro-export policies also resulted in Egypt becoming the second most expensive place to live in the world in the late 1830s due to domestic grain shortages. After this, the policy was altered to allow for stockpiles in case of emergencies. This stockpile regulation, a blockade by Western powers in the 1840s, and extreme Nile flooding prevented lucrative grain exports, but they recovered starting in 1843. Muhammad Ali started a process of shifting his army away from his irregular Albanians and into a modernized army. He initially planned on using slaves from Sudan, but was convinced to recruit the Egyptian peasantry due to difficulties with the Sudanese military campaign. 20,000 slaves were captured from Sudan between 1820 and 1824, but only 3,000 were still alive by 1824. The core of his new army were still Mamluks and Sudanese trained by Joseph Anthome Seve. Seve eventually became the second highest ranking officer in the Egyptian army, only behind Muhammad Ali's son Ibrahim Pasha. Seve later joined Muhammad Ali in his campaign against the Greeks, and was replaced by Pierre-François Xavier Boyer. Ali, who thought lowly of the native Egyptians, prevented the officer positions from being filled with them. The army would not gain native Egyptian leaders until under Said, and even then there were only 4 native Egyptian colonels by 1882. Prior to 1841, the Egyptian army reached around 100,000 men, but was later forced down to 18,000 men. The army had an interesting way of recruiting officers. Turkish officers were highly sought after, and so they were recruited from Ottoman prisoners of war, and even had regiments created from POWs. Another interesting part of the army were the half-disabled regiments formed from soldiers who suffered wounds, but were still able to fight. These regiments were also led by a half-disabled officer. In 1822, Seve and 2 other men were tasked with reorganizing the Egyptian army. Their version was basically a copy of Napoleon's army. However, Muhammad Ali rejected this, as, although the plan that Suleiman Agha had put down is a wonderful one, it has been implemented by Napoleon to lead an army composed of several thousand troops. Our army, however, is a new one, which we have only recently begun creating. He had Ibrahim oversee the men in creating a new model based around the army of Selim III. This new army experienced some impressive victories. 2,500 Egyptian soldiers defeated a Wahhabist army 10 times their size. An 1824 rebellion of 30,000 people led by a Mahdi claimant was defeated by 3,500 soldiers. One of Egypt's greatest victories in this period was at Konya. Ibrahim, leading an army of 15,000 men, defeated an Ottoman army of over 50,000 men. This victory left the path to Istanbul open and won the war for the Egyptians. His army had significant problems, though. The poor conditions and the pay resulted in many rebellions, and a large amount of desertions. It was also common for the soldiers to not even be paid for years. Soldiers fighting Greece in 1828 had been unpaid for 16 months, and a mutiny broke out in Hijaz in 1832 after being unpaid for 20 months. Recruitment was simply the impressment of peasants. A few thousand Egyptians even fled to Syria to avoid conscription in 1826, and Governor Abdullah Pasha ibn Ali granted tax exemption for 3 years in land. Muhammad Ali ordered him to return to these refugees, but he rejected this demand. Muhammad Ali would later use this as one of his pretexts for invading Syria. This style of recruitment came to an end in the 1840s due to lack of men and an 18,000 men limit in the army. Legally, the Ottomans held the monopolistic right to produce ammunition and gunpowder. Muhammad Ali ignored this, of course, and established factories to produce these in the 1810s. By the time of his Greek campaign, one of his factories was producing 3 to 4 cannons and over 625 muskets per month. Muhammad Ali expanded the navy after a British attack in 1807. This new fleet started with 18 ships weighing between 100 and 150 tons. Egypt did see navies destroyed in future campaigns, but was able to easily reconstruct them.